All of humanity shares a single mother. Not a slogan, not a statement of faith. This was the conclusion 3 scientists arrived at in 1987. After staring at their data in silence for a long time, they had no other choice. They analyzed genetic samples from 147 individuals across 5 distinct racial groups, tracing a strand of DNA passed only from mother to child, never mixing with the father's genes, and found that every trail led back to the same woman. The scientists placed her in Africa, roughly 200,000 years ago, and they gave her a name. Perhaps the oldest name in all of human history, Eve. The first time I read about this study, I was in Turkey on an ordinary afternoon. Outside the window, the street was loud and chaotic. People downstairs yelling, whether arguing or haggling, I couldn't tell. Millions of people crammed into one city, strangers to each other, and I sat there staring at that name, Eve. It was a name I first encountered after becoming a Christian, but we didn't name her first. The scientists borrowed it. I don't know whether those scientists held any religious beliefs, but they chose that name. Maybe because the data itself pointed toward that story. But here's something most people overlook. Those 147 people weren't all descended from just this one woman. 200,000 years ago, there were many women alive on Earth at the same time. They all had children, and those children had children of their own. But only this one woman's maternal line never broke. Every other woman's line at some point. For some reason, war, disease, a generation of only sons, or something else entirely, simply ended, quietly erased from history. Not because she was stronger or smarter than the others. Just an unbroken line, a thread impossibly thin, stretched across 200,000 years. In the years I've spent here in Turkey, having come from Taiwan, I've met many people, especially refugees who walked out of Syria because of war, mothers carrying children with no idea where tomorrow would take them. I'd sometimes wonder, would their stories just disappear? Would their line go silent in some future generation, forgotten by everyone? And then I'd think back to that data. The line didn't break 200,000 years. And it didn't break. Science gave us a name, Mitochondrial Eve. But Genesis gives us an older question. Who was Eve? For most people, the answer stops at a familiar image. A woman, a rib, a talking snake, and something that looks suspiciously like the Apple logo. A fruit with a bite taken out of it. But what if I told you that the word rib might have been a mistranslation from the very beginning? The original Hebrew word appears nearly 40 times across the Old Testament, and almost every single time, it refers to the side of a building, the flank of the ark, the side chambers of the temple. But in this one passage, it becomes rib. Have you ever stopped to wonder if not a rib, then what? The Hebrew word is sila. In the Old Testament, it describes the side chambers of the temple, the flanks of the ark, or the other side of a mountain. Its core meaning is always the other half of a whole. So some scholars argue that what God actually did wasn't remove a small piece of bone from Adam, but rather split Adam down the side, dividing one complete being into two, each whole in their own right. Not like pulling a piece from a puzzle. This was a division, an equal act of creation. Eve wasn't an add-on to Adam. She was the half of him he lost. Then Genesis uses another word to describe her role, helper. A lot of people frown at that helper. Isn't that just an assistant, a servant? But the Hebrew word is Ezer. And throughout the Old Testament, this same word is repeatedly used to describe God himself. Psalm 121 says, "My help comes from the Lord." That's the same word. This isn't the role of a servant. It's an indispensable rescuer, an equal protector. Eve wasn't created to serve Adam the way ChatGPT was built to serve people. She was created to accomplish what Adam simply could not do alone. I find this reading genuinely compelling, because the word mistranslated, as rib may be hiding a much deeper logic. Human wholeness, from the very beginning, required two dimensions to exist. Not a subject and an attachment, but two sides together forming one complete being. What God has joined together, let no one separate. The moment that wholeness was divided, both became incomplete at once. Maybe that's why nearly every culture on Earth carries this idea of searching for your other half. Not a romantic invention, but something ancient, written into the very structure of what it means to be human. Back in that 1987 lab, quietly working through the data, was UC Berkeley scientist Rebecca Cann and her team. No religious agenda, just following the data until it led them to that name. When their findings were published in Nature, the backlash was enormous. Not because the data was flawed, but because the conclusion was simply too much for most people to swallow. Later studies refined the timeline from an initial range of 140,000 to 290,000 years ago, down to roughly 100,000 to 150,000 years. But the core conclusion never changed. Every modern human's maternal lineage, traced all the way back, leads to a single source. No matter how long it takes. Picture that line, starting from one woman, passing through ice ages, through plagues, through wars, through every night it could have ended, running all the way to today, all the way to you, watching this right now. That line never broke. You are where that line is now. Science calls her Mitochondrial Eve. Genesis calls her the mother of all living. Two entirely different starting points, both pointing back to the same woman at the beginning. I just think when the data and the story point in the same direction, it's like a detective spotting a clue, worth sitting down and taking a closer look. And yet, Eve came from Adam. And Adam is a figure we've almost entirely misunderstood. What did the first human being actually possess before that wholeness was divided? What archaeology has dug up is far more unsettling than you might expect. We assume humanity has always been moving forward, but the data tells a different story. The Bible says, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. If you enjoy searching for small truths in the long river of history, hit subscribe and we'll pick this up in the next episode.